let's start with 1909. In 1909, the American Blacksmiths Union, I know that's what you came here to talk about, they were experiencing this unexpected dip in membership, and so there was an appeal that went out, and they were like, okay, everybody who's a blacksmith, we need you to invite one extra person to be a member of the Blacksmiths Union. And American blacksmiths responded like champs. They invited their friends, and sure enough, the next year there was a rise in the number of blacksmiths in the Blacksmiths Union. And within 10 years, the blacksmith's trade was practically dead. How come? Yes? Yeah, I heard it. Because of that. Because the year before, Henry Ford started rolling out the Model T. And within a year, he had rolled out things like tractors and stuff like that. It wasn't that the transportation industry didn't need leaders, but the transportation industry was changing. And so the kind of leaders that it needed for that industry had to change with it. So I kind of think that we are in a situation today where theological institutions like Princeton, like Fuller, are at risk of preparing better blacksmiths than we have prepared at any time in our history. Now, the problem, of course, is not that we don't need leaders in the church, but the church is changing. And so the leaders that we need to prepare for the church need to change too. Most of you have had a moment like this already, but let's see if this reminds you of anything in your church. This is an old movie. You probably know this clip, but see what this reminds you of where you serve. It's from Apollo 13. The point is that most of us have had that Houston, we have a problem moment in church at this point, where we have hit a contingency nobody even remotely had thought of at this point, where the oxygen that had fueled the church up as we knew it, had begun to leak out, and there was nothing that we had at our disposal that we knew of that could fix it. So we've had to hack the system in ways that we hadn't imagined, and we've had to come up with creative but temporary fixes. Now, let me just ask, how many of you guys are Fuller grads or have come to a course or some kind of a training at Fuller before? Okay, a lot of you. So let me just say that it is not lost on me that I'm talking about this subject of entrepreneurial ministry at the most entrepreneurial theological school in the nation, right? You guys are sitting at the edge of Silicon Valley, right? You are in the middle of this conversation, and you have been part of the innovation and ministry conversation longer than anybody else. For those of you who have been students here, you've taken classes from Scott Kermode, you've been in Joel Green's apostolic ministry mission courses, you've probably canoed the mountains with Ted Bolsinger, you've stuck around with the Sticky Faith people. IDEO, when I first saw the whole design thinking thing, which was born in your neighborhood, and the first step of design thinking is empathy. I'm like, well, yeah, that's called mission. But of course, we learned that substantially from the School of Intercultural Studies, right? Where the first step in mission is to listen. Empathy, everyone in ministry already knows that, partly because of the modeling that we have had that has taken place here at Fuller. But partly because you guys have front seats in Silicon Valley, you know also with particular clarity the weak spots in the innovator's armor and the vulnerability behind every big idea. And I'm sure you've noticed how seldom young people who want to change the world turn to the church to do it. You've probably noticed that young people, even seminary graduates who want to serve God faithfully, often decide that the best way to do that is to go outside the church. You probably noticed that young people who no longer see themselves within their particular religious tradition don't wait around for us to catch up with them, and they actively seek meaning and purpose and community elsewhere. We'll talk more about that tomorrow. But interestingly, churches somehow see this marriage between social entrepreneurship and ministry with huge ambivalence. Gregory Deese, who coined the term social entrepreneurship in 1998, he was an atheist, interestingly enough, but he was mystified by the contemporary church's disinterest in this movement. He's like, what happened? He asked this of his dean, who at the time was Gregory Jones, who of the dean of Duke Divinity School, and he says, what happened to the church? He said, social entrepreneurship emerged in business schools in part because of the decline of interest by the church. See, what Deese knew that churches forgot is that social innovation started in churches. Historically, churches, we don't think about this today. We think of churches being places that kind of good ideas go to die. But historically, it was just the opposite of that. And Deese knew that social innovation began in churches, and that he worried that if churches were not going to get involved, the social entrepreneur movement was going to die. Now, Jones took the opposite view, that if the church didn't get involved, the church was going to be jeopardized. Today, I want to suggest a more counterintuitive point. And that is this, that there are dozens of reasons right now that churches are clamoring to get on board to this movement, but a lot of those reasons are defensive, which does not make them good reasons to be involved in this. A lot of big ideas will not save the church. Only Jesus Christ saves the church. But at the end of the day, there's only one reason to become a social entrepreneur, and that's out of love. Do it for love or don't do it. So let me explain. Now, there are a lot of ways to understand entrepreneurship. I happen to find Tina Selig's work out of Harvard on creativity to be helpful in distinguishing some of the terms that we use. We can unpack all that stuff later. But just suffice it to say that for our conversation, I'm going to use the word entrepreneur the way English majors use it, not the way business majors use it, which means it's an evocative, not a technical term. The word entrepreneur in French literally means an undertaking between. In other words, it's something you undertake in the gaps between what's already there. And the link between innovation and entrepreneurship is ancient. In Scripture, the most common word in Greek used for new is kainos, which means not found exactly like this before. Right? So in Revelation 21:5, God is crowing from the eschatological throne, behold, I'm making all things not exactly found as they have been before. Behold, I'm making all things new. So it turns out that the Bible actually begins and ends with stories about God innovating. So we like to assign this entrepreneurial spirit to young people, particularly social entrepreneurship, that triple bottom line that insists on doing good while doing well at the same time. But that picture is pretty complex. So some random facts here. Entrepreneurial ventures are up 60% since 2011 in the US. Universities offer 20 times the number of courses that they used to 30 years ago. And it turns out that we are the least entrepreneurial generation right now of people under 30 than has been in 25 years. Like, what? Something doesn't add up there. So let's look at social entrepreneurship. If you ask them, 90% of millennials, by the way, only 19% of millennials will call themselves millennials, but they will call themselves entrepreneurs, okay? 90% will call themselves entrepreneurial. They want to start their own businesses. You can see the statistics there. About a fourth of them already have started some kind of a social enterprise. 90% say they are willing to take risks. 80% say they want to be their own boss. 40% say they're going to invent something that'll change the world. They're grandiose, but they're optimistic, right? Now, the catch is here, they want to do these things. But they're not actually doing these things yet. What we're learning is that 40 is the sweet spot if you're going to actually start your own thing. 25 isn't when you're doing it. Typically, this generation is the way they're explaining this is 25-year-olds as a group are pretty risk averse. They're really far in debt because of student loans. And they're surrounded by a world where big corporations eat small coffee shops for breakfast. So they are not in a situation where they feel like they can take those risks right now. So what they're doing is working for other people who are entrepreneurs. And the projections are that in about 10 years, we're going to have a very highly skilled entrepreneurial workforce ready to start their own thing. All right, so what does that mean for ministry? It's hardly a new way to think about ministry, for one thing. In the ancient church, work was a way that you generated income for the common good of society. And by the Middle Ages, it was the church and not Silicon Valley that was the engine of social innovation. Christian communities were that's how you founded schools and hospitals and hospices. And your worshiping communities kind of emerged out of that. You found the hospital first, and then the worshiping community would emerge from the people that were there serving those who were sick. Monasteries were the people who created sustainable agriculture practices. They were the people who perfected consumer products like cheese and beer. We have the Benedictines to thank. Some people think Hildegard of Bingen for adding hops to ale. They tried to create these sustainable communities so that they wouldn't burden the poor, and also to model a way of life that was worthy of the name Christian. In the Middle Ages, monasteries and convents were incubators of new forms of education and social innovation. Remember that monks and nuns at this time were usually the only people in town who could read or write. And so they experimented with new forms of art and music and education and spiritual practices and even forms of citizenship. What people forget is the civic orders that happened during the Enlightenment were borrowed from many of the practices of governance in the monastic communities. So churches led to a way of life that tried to make life easier on people. It tried to make people flourish in more full ways. So for example, I'm sure your church is still like this. They were the early adopters of technology. The first mechanical clock was invented by monks to call people to prayer. The first blast furnace, the first cast iron, the first artesian wells, and the first mills that were powered by the tides as opposed to by manual labor. All of this was to ease burden on human laborers. Monasteries, as we said, modeled self-sustaining communities, and they generated income by selling things like Munster cheese. The word Munster means monk. By selling burning water for medicine, also known as alcohol. They also sold leftover communion wine to make money for the community. In other words, if you were a young person in the Middle Ages, especially if you were a woman, and you wanted to flee social norms or create something new or make a difference in the world, what you did was you dreamed of a life in the church instead of working for Tom's Shoes. So what happened? Right? Well, the simple story is with the onset of modernity, we became a highly differentiated society. And we started labeling church activities as spiritual and business activities as profane. And we stopped learning from each other's experience, and we learned to be suspicious of each other's motives. And without the ethical constraints of the church, business could and often did become unmoored from moral responsibility. And without the community relationships required by business, churches could and often did become insular and self-absorbed. Well, today those lines are blurring again, and that causes churches to start reconsidering their relationships with enterprise. And there are a lot of reasons why churches begin to get involved in this missional innovation conversation. 3 of those common reasons have to do with finances. Churches are needing new revenue streams. Creativity, they need to find ways to do things more creatively. And community engagement, they need to find ways to be more missionally involved in their communities. But here's what's different right now. Entrepreneurship is not just a way to fund your ministry. It is a form of ministry. Call it whole life evangelism or whole life discipleship or whatever you want to call it. So for example, if your church has a food truck, which mine happens to have, I go to a little tiny church, about 60, 70 people, And it's about 80% millennials. And so this is the way our church does mission to college students. We have a lot of college students in our town. It's not just, the food truck is not just a way to fund the cost of hanging out with college students. It is the way our church hangs out with college students. The economic model itself is the form of ministry. But it also is a way that we get to engage and share life with people in our community that we would not know otherwise. So we know people that we absolutely wouldn't know and would not know us if it were not for this truck. We know bakers, we know mechanics, we know a lot of mechanics because this truck is broken down all the time. We know zoning officials, we know organic farmers, we know all the chickens and the eggs in the county because of this food truck. And we just plain would not know them, and they would not know us if we did not have this vehicle, literally, for sharing life together. Yes, it provides money to do mission with the homeless shelter because we can give them the same meals for free because we have this economic engine. And because we're such a small church, it's about the only way we can fund that kind of ministry. But it turns out that this is a deeply historic and rigorous way of doing Christian witness, because it's not just your job that makes you a minister, it's your way of life, right? Now, what's ironic about this is that a lot of young people, like the people who go to my church and probably the people who go to yours, are looking for this kind of whole life witness. And when they don't find it in the church, what they're doing is they're looking for it at places like Tom's Shoes. And I'm not just using Tom's Shoes lightly as an example. Now, those of you who have done short-term mission work, you can criticize Tom's Shoes 6 Ways to Sunday because they've got all the same problems as short-term mission does in churches. But this report just came out yesterday from YPulse, which is a teen marketing outfit in New York City. And they asked young people, if you want to do good in the world, who do you want to work for? And guess who won, hands down? Not the church, Tom's Shoes. And there was not another organization that was even close. Now, why? What's behind this entrepreneurial impulse in young people? I mean, what is causing this kind of interest and energy and drive in them? And if we dismiss this as just adolescent idealism or maybe a response to a crappy economy, those things play a part. But if that's all we blame this on, we're going to miss something that's really important here. So I want to suggest a couple of things. First of all, there's young people themselves. That's my nod to Tom's Shoes. Young people themselves are self-aware of some of the contradictory impulses here, and they have a sense of humor about it. You've probably heard this word by now, adulting. You know, it's now a verb, at least according to Urban Dictionary. To do grown-up things and hold responsibilities, such as a 9-to-5 job. You have a mortgage, you pay rent, you have a car payment, or anything else that makes one think of grown-ups, okay? Most young people will not call themselves a grown-up until they're 26. In case you care. But this word apparently is now on Twitter 700% more than it used to be. It's a largely, now there are adulting academies. Have you seen these? Where you can actually, you can enroll yourself in a course that will teach you adult skills, like how to balance your checkbook and stuff like that. We know that young people, we talk about this in different ways, are the canaries in the mines, if you want to think about it negatively, or the radioisotopes, if you want to think about it more positively, of our larger society. They act out in acute form. Some of our underlying social architecture and some of our values, they perform out in front of us, ways that our entire culture tends to make sense of the world. And while this has to be adjusted for context and social location, young adults do tell us something about ourselves broadly as a culture, and that bears paying attention to. I'm going to mention 2 underlying causes, I think, of the young adult entrepreneurial impulse that we shouldn't miss. First, for those of you who are critiquing, I know this wasn't in the paper, but I forgot it, so I'm adding it now. Sorry, surprise. Anyway, The first is what artists have called the new sincerity. It's kind of a artistic philosophical movement. It's what with late millennials or some of those moving into Gen Z or whatever we call the next group. What it means is that irony is out and earnestness is in. If you really, really, really want to be authentic, be awkward, actually. There's one of the guys at our church, in fact, we have buttons that say for our greeters, we feel awkward, so you don't have to. So anyway, in the way this plays out in middle-class young people is through exhaustingly earnest consumerism, very intentional. These are the people bringing the mugs to church, that kind of stuff. And the Washington Post did a kind of a story where they were infiltrating farmers markets and just sort of watching what was happening there. And what they noticed was that there was just a lot of questioning about how the tomatoes were grown and whether they were, organically taken, grown and what pesticides weren't used and so on. What they noticed was there were no questions about the conditions of the workers who were growing the tomatoes, right? But there was a lot of care about the tomatoes themselves. Anyway, in beleaguered communities, this looks kind of different. And remember, the New Sincerity was first named among artists. It was actually a play on Broadway. And it often takes the form of truth-telling art. And you'll recognize this in comedians like Aziz Ansari, in novelists, in filmmakers like Marlon Hall, and novelists like J.D. Vance, who wrote Hillbilly Elegy. And you remember, I think it actually explains a lot of the political movements that we are seeing as well. I think you could say that this is behind Black Lives Matter. I think it certainly explains the appeal among young people of Bernie Sanders and Congressman Ted Lieu. This exhausting earnestness and honesty. The entrepreneurial moment in ministry makes sense for the new sincerity because the impulse to do good among millennials is so strong that even those who don't want to do good wish they wanted to do good, right? So for better or worse, misinformed or not, they do not trust the church as the primary institution to have a positive impact on society. What do they trust? Small business, right? It's interesting that government is at the bottom because the facts of the matter are that if you really want to have a positive impact on society, politics is probably the way to do it. We know that in terms of alleviating poverty, it's been governmental changes that have actually had the biggest difference in terms of changing people's lives. But this is what young people believe is true anyway. Okay, that's the first reason I think that this is part of the draw to the entrepreneurial sensibility. The second reason, though, that this devotion to entrepreneurship is there goes even deeper into our veins as a culture. If you've read Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor, first of all, congratulations. Either his early work, The Age of Authenticity, or his massive The Secular Age, you know that he argues that the dominant cultural ethos that we are in, we operate within what he calls the immanent frame. And what that is, it's a flattening out of our horizons so that our own experience, whatever is true is that which is true for us, right? Whatever is real is that which we ourselves experience to be real. The parameters of reality extend as far as the water that we ourselves swim in. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that we're not God-haunted, as Taylor says. Sometimes there are cracks in the immanent frame where the light gets in, as Leonard Cohen would say. Sometimes there are things that seem to poke at us from beyond ourselves, but to break out of this immanent frame is actually impossible, so we're left with only cracks. And the immanent frame is so much longer than this discussion can possibly do justice to. Taylor spends 600 pages trying to make it make sense. But young people's entrepreneurial interest is in part a representation of their discomfort with the immanent frame that they are stuck inside. Now, they have to live within it. We all have to live within it. But we can do so. We can either be open, living within it, or we can be closed to it. But social entrepreneurship is kind of an attempt to open that horizon a little bit so it's not quite so suffocating. It's kind of an attempt to get beyond it just a little bit. And that's why stories like the story about Maggie Baron-Kitsy become such a strong symbol for what young people are trying to hold together here. Now, this is a story about a life that is violently trapped within an immanent frame, and the story of faith in which God reaches into that frame through people exploiting these cracks in it. If there's one missional entrepreneur who exploits these cracks in a way that I find really inspiring, it's Maggie Baron-Kitsy. Now, let me just set this up a little bit. She is the founder of a youth village called Maison Shalom in Burundi. And it began during Burundi's brutal civil war. I think this video will speak for itself, and then we'll talk more about it. So just watch. Yeah, wow. That's my reaction too. Now, this is more than just philanthropy, right? I mean, this is practicing resurrection. This is the difference between mere social entrepreneurship and missional entrepreneurship. This is practicing what God's love does and not just what human love can do. This community, this way of life at Maison Shalom is what proclaims the gospel. It is a kind of human flourishing that goes beyond just trying to restore something that was lost. It is trying to restore a kind of original blessedness, a kind of restoring what God intended in terms of human flourishing. It's a reenactment of resurrection. In the end, the only reason to make missional entrepreneurship central to ministry is because when you love somebody, you will spin straw into gold to stop them from suffering. When you love somebody, you will take a moonshot to restore joy to the equation. You'll build Maison Shalom to help children flourish. You'll build a swimming pool to redeem the killing fields. The only reason to become a missional entrepreneur is because, like Maggie Baron-Kitsy, love has made you an inventor. Not your love, Christ's love. And then not even death can stop you. So it's true that desperation makes us more creative. It's a spiritual gift in a lot of ways. It makes us more open for change as a church than we have been any time since I've been in ministry. And thankfully, few of us have faced the kind of trauma that Maggie has faced at that gave rise to Maison Shalom. But it's also true that spiritual desperation can make us vulnerable to some motivations that we might want to be cautious about as well. And so before we close, I want to tackle three of those head on. Those of you who are Princess Bride fans, we're going to call these ROUSs. The first one, the Rodent of Relevance. So this is churches that might be doing missional entrepreneurship because it's the next big idea, and this will make our church more in line with the times, right? It's true, a decade ago, not many people were talking about missional entrepreneurship except probably Fuller. It lacked a vocabulary. I mean, I was trying to figure this out like 5 years ago on a sabbatical, and I didn't even know what to call it, you know? Entrepreneurship was largely left to business. Church leaders were making occasional forays into business literature to plunder the Egyptians. Today, there are incubators and accelerators and shark tanks for Jesus and co-working spaces and design thinking and countless other support systems for missional innovators in the church. In 1636, by the way, if you were a Puritan, being an innovator was such a serious accusation, you could get your ears cut off for that. By the 1990s, the buzzword was so prominent that people were talking about innovation overload. That was a generation ago, and it's only picked up speed. But innovation and impersonation are two different things. And at minimum, you need a culture to support innovation, not just a big idea. Cultures of innovation, you can find this kind of list everywhere, but these are the kinds of things that we're talking about if you want a culture of innovation. I don't know if this describes your church, but my church has a way to go before we get here. You know, high levels of diversity, got to listen well, collaborative work style and communication styles, lots of small experiments, high tolerance for failure. That right there stops most of us. Lots of improvisation. By the way, do you know why WD-40 is called WD-40? Because it stands for water displacement. It took 40 tries before they got it right. Otherwise, it'd be called WD-38, right? So they were willing to improvise until they figured it out, okay? So here, what we can say, just remember that it's too hard to do innovation just to do it because it's the next big idea. Maison Shalom started because of a massacre, not because of a big idea. Interestingly, the day after that massacre in Ruigi, Maggie returned and she buried the 72 people she saw die in front of her. She risked her life to do that. That theater that she built, that theater was the second theater in all of Burundi, the second one. And so you know what? The soldiers and the militia, they wanted to see movies too. And so she put a sign on the door that said, you got to put down your weapons first before you come see a movie. So what she was doing was letting the same soldiers who came and did the massacre come sit with the children in this. You see what's going on here? Right? But she puts a sign on the door saying, you got to put your weapons down. That sign angered the people who were in charge of the militia. So they said, we're going to send somebody to kill Maggie. Maggie, being Maggie, met the assassin when he got there. Said, you don't want to do that. And he said, oh? And she said, yeah, this is stupid. You're living in the brush. You're living out there in the wilderness. She said, why don't you live here instead? I'll give you a job. I'll give you a bed. I'll give you a place to live. You can do something good with your life. And he said, oh, okay. And the reason we know that story is because he told that story to the Duke faculty when they went to visit there, because that guy is now Maggie's driver, right? Wow. It's a myth that successful entrepreneurs drop everything to take their moonshot. The most successful entrepreneurs are those who procrastinate long enough to learn from somebody else first, okay? They build their big ideas incrementally, and you know why they stick with it? It's because somebody they love needs them to do it enough that they don't quit. Here's what we can say with some assurance about the churches and missional entrepreneurship. We're a long way from getting this right. What we can't, there's a byproduct that I think we can call the velvet underground effect. Anybody know about the velvet underground? I love this. This is, Andy Warhol had a house band, the Velvet Underground, in the 1960s. They weren't a very good band. He wasn't a very good manager. They made an album in 1967 that sells for thousands of dollars on eBay now, and mostly experimental tracks. They played on instruments. None of them played very well. Rolling Stone panned it. They only sold 10,000 copies, and it's considered one of the most influential albums in rock and roll history. Anybody know why? There was a music critic that said this: because every single person who bought that album went out and started a band. Here's why. Because if you were a teenager in the 1960s and you heard this band and you heard all these experimental and weird sounds on that album and these weird chord progressions, it encouraged you to experiment too. You heard them and went, wait, I can do that. And so in a do-it-yourself culture, you don't have to be perfect to make a difference. You just have to try stuff. So there's this blessing in being awkward, right? In today's young people, awkward is replaced as this new sign of being cool. You can try things without being perfect. And so the Velvet Underground is credited with empowering this whole generation of teenagers into trying to be musicians, and they infiltrated the music business and changed it forever. So missional innovation gives us a chance to do that too. Churches that value innovation try things, even if they're not perfect. And they give young people the distinct impression that they can try things too. And guess what? The church will welcome them if they try it. They'll give it a shot. So if we see someone doing audacious ministry, these fallible and imperfect efforts, they give us the sense that we just might be innovators too. Second, the remarkable rodent. This is another thing that we might want to avoid. Churches that are doing missional entrepreneurship to save the world, because it'll make us we can make a bigger difference. And you can understand this because it's easy to see why we can be so enthralled with social entrepreneurship. It seems to deliver miracles. If you watch the Super Bowl, nobody sells products anymore. They sell the good that you will do in the world if you buy this product, right? After all, how many churches can say that they, somehow saved a militia member by giving him a bed and a job? New York Times made the comment that millennials' cultural heroes aren't celebrities or artists or reformers. They're social entrepreneurs. It's always easy to confuse our saviors, right? But positing missional innovation as a savior of the world isn't noble, it's naive. It's also heretical. It's also a fast road to disappointment. No human enterprise, missional or otherwise, is up to the task of salvation. Expecting missional innovation to save anyone, including the church, to put it mildly, is a quick road to failure. Now, it doesn't stop young people from hoping that that will be the case. Americans have more confidence in small business than any other social institution to do good in the world. There are a lot of good stories about people who've taken risks in the name of Christ that led to entrepreneurial ministry, but none of them did it to change the world. They did it because of someone they loved and because they loved God. One of those people is Richard Joyner. I took my class to meet this guy last fall. He's the son and grandson of sharecroppers in Kenda, North Carolina, population 300, which about 7 years ago now. Of these 300 people, about 80 of them are winding up in ER every year with significant long-term illnesses. A lot of them dietary related. They're about 30 miles from the nearest grocery store. He was doing about a dozen funerals a year, many for people in their 30s. And he had this one funeral of a guy who had a couple of little kids, and he was so disturbed by the funeral, he pulled over by the side of the road, and he said he had to just stop and pray, because he said, I don't know how many times I can keep telling these kids whose dad won't be there to walk them down the aisle that things are going to be all right. Because in his words, he says, that was a damn lie. And so he said he prayed, and he said, God, this dying has got to stop. What do you want me to do? And he said he opened his eyes and he looked all around, and all he saw was this. And he said, I knew what I had to do. And I hate farming. He vowed never to farm again. Farming just didn't end well for his people. And so he said, I prayed again. Is anybody else up there? Anyway, he had a community meeting with his church, and boy, his parishioners just balked. They did not have good memories of farming. And then a 12-year-old girl with tears running down her face got up in front of her congregation, and she said, I need you to help me. My dad has died, my grandmother has died, and I don't want to be alone. I need you to help me. Please help me. Now, the adults wouldn't help him. So Richard started farming with the kids in his congregation and in the community. And they came after school, and they started a garden. And pretty soon they were taking produce home to their parents. And then pretty soon they started another garden. Kids came after school. One kid got kicked out of school, and he became Richard's primary helper. That kid now has a full scholarship to college and is a certified beekeeper. Anyway, pretty soon people in his congregation got on board and became nutrition specialists and trainers and so on. And Richard was named a CNN hero a couple of years ago. The emergency room visits from Kenda went from 80 to 5. The hospital called to see what was going on. It turned out the pastor had started a garden with some kids. Third, the rodent of power and influence. Churches that are doing missional entrepreneurship because they think it's going to give them some, traction. It's going to create new revenue streams or some marketing appeal. Will make our church more solvent or more attractive to young people. Well, probably not. Those things work almost never. Missional entrepreneurship is not going to solve your church's problems without creating some new ones. In the first place, almost all entrepreneurs overestimate the return on investments. Only a few missional enterprises return enough on their investment to support a congregation. Is a good day if your outreach will support itself. Some missional enterprises do become attractive to young people. It's more likely they'll be committed to the missional enterprise, not to the congregation itself. Usually starting a missional enterprise creates at least as many problems as it solves. So you got to be sure you want to do it. It's a lot like marriage counseling. It's going to get worse before it gets better. So there's only one reason to do marriage counseling, which is love, right? The point of missional entrepreneurship is not to make the church more productive or powerful or solvent for that matter. You might have recognized in these three rodents the echoes of Henry Nouwen warning Christian leaders against the temptations of being relevant or spectacular or powerful. This is what young people are calling us out on. Somehow, in preparing excellent blacksmiths, we've lost sight of the fact that joy and flourishing for all people is a Christian concern. Nouwen reminds us that being in love with Jesus means loving those Jesus loves and outdoing one another in trying to find ways to bless the beloved. That's the goal of all missional innovation. And it's certainly not to help us survive as a church. It's not just to do good things, but to see that all of the people that God loves have life and have it abundantly. So for now, I'm leaving you with this. Missional entrepreneurship is not about your big idea. Your big idea is irrelevant except for that person in the back of your mind whom God has called you to love. Love is what made Maggie Baron-Kitze an inventor, not her big idea, not her desire to solve a funding problem or to change the church or to change the world for that matter. She just loved those kids too much to let war or hatred claim them. So in the absence of any other way of going forward, love made her an inventor, and it wasn't her love, it was Christ's love that made it happen. So here's the thing, we're not called to have great ideas, we're called to have great love. At the end of the day, the church is a lot less like rodents than like a lobster. Yeah, I know you saw that coming. So here's the thing, I learned about lobsters, this is where I can't get it out from this microphone, so just bear with me for a second. I might act this out. I learned about lobsters when I was in Maine a couple years ago, but there's actually a great, if you want a description, there's a great description in a book called The New Parish. Or you could go on YouTube. It's possible I've spent way too much time watching lobsters molt on YouTube. They're crustaceans, right? So theoretically, they can live forever, but they've got to do what? They've got to molt, right? Because if they stay in the thing is, their shells, they get too small. So if you stay inside your shell too long, you're going to die because it's going to squeeze you to death. So the shell grows too tight and you got to get a new one. So here's what happens, right? So the lobster takes on, if you're going to molt, the lobster has to take on extra water first. And what that does is it loosens the shell, right? Until the shell gets kind of loose and bunchy and it doesn't fit real well. And then it starts to crack, right? And then once the shell is cracked, now what the lobster has to do is the lobster has to turn himself inside out, right? Even those big claws, they have to come inside. They get turned inside out through these tiny little holes in the back. So that pulls himself inside out. And then these eyes out here, the eyes they even have to turn the eyes inside out. This is incredible, right? So the eyes, they have to come inside too. And so now the lobster is blind on top of everything else. So he can't see what's going on. So the lobster's blind, he's turning himself inside out, and eventually he gets all inside this shell, and now he's turned inside out, and he has to now kick the shell off with his tail. And now, so finally, he's turned all inside out, he kicks the tail off. And you'd think that was the end, right? But no, because you're a lobster now without a shell, which means you're all soft and squishy. So if you're gonna get eaten as a lobster, now's the time. So all you can do is just sit and wait and hope nobody eats you because you have to wait for your new shell to harden, okay? And you're blind, and the world, you can't see very well what's going on. You don't know if you're gonna get eaten or not in this period, right? And eventually, the shell hardens around you and the world comes back into focus and you go back to being a lobster. I think that's the church we're in. We're at various stages of turning ourselves inside out. We are bloated as a church. Our shells are really cracked and not fitting real well. Some of us have turned various parts. Some of us kicked off the shell. We can't see what's going on. We don't know whether we're going to get eaten or not. But the bottom line is this. We can't see what's ahead. But one thing is clear, if we're going to live, we have to get rid of this old shell. We have to let God make us into something new. Behold, God reminds us, I am doing a new thing that has not been done exactly like this before. Not because God has a big idea, but because God is love. Thank you.